Grace Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of her kitchen as acrid smoke billowed from the massive commercial oven that had been her grandmother's pride and joy. The lunch rush was in full swing at Whitmore's kitchen, and she could hear the concerned murmurs of customers drifting through the service window. Her flour-dusted apron was already stained with perspiration from her frantic attempts to salvage the situation. "Come on," she whispered, frantically pressing buttons on the temperamental control panel. The ancient beast had been acting up for weeks, but today it had finally declared war. Smoke detectors shrieked overhead while Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the only appliance repair service within 50 miles of Millbrook. "Falls, Henderson's Appliance Repair. This is Sue. Sue, this is Grace Whitmore at the diner on Main Street. My oven is smoking and I have a full restaurant. Honey, I'm sorry, but Jim's out with his back again. I can try to get someone from the county, but it'll be at least 3 hours. Grace's vision blurred with tears of frustration. 3 hours meant losing the entire lunch service, which meant losing money she desperately needed to keep the lights on. "Please, isn't there anyone—" "Wait, hold on. There's a new fellow in town. Does repair work. Marcus something. Real professional looking. You want his number?" 20 minutes later, Grace heard the rumble of a pickup truck outside. Through the smoke-hazed window, she watched a tall man with dark hair step out, carrying a professional toolbox that looked expensive enough to cost more than her monthly rent. He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The bell above the front door chimed, and Grace called out, "We're closed for repairs!" But the footsteps continued toward the kitchen anyway. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus Reed. You called about an oven." Grace turned around and felt her breath catch. The man standing in her kitchen doorway was definitely not what she'd expected from a small-town repair service. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the humidity. His work clothes were clean and well-fitted, and his eyes, a warm brown that seemed to take in everything at once, held an intelligence that made her suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. "You're not what I expected," Grace admitted. Pushing a strand of blonde hair out of her face, Marcus smiled, and something about that smile made the chaos around them seem manageable. "I get that a lot. Now let's see what we're dealing with." He approached the smoking oven with the calm confidence of a surgeon approaching an operating table. Grace watched, mesmerized, as he examined the control panel, tested various switches, and peered into vents she hadn't even known existed. His hands moved with practiced precision, and she noticed he wore what looked like a college ring on his right hand. Expensive, with some kind of engineering symbol. "When did this start?" he asked, not looking up from his examination. "About 2 weeks ago it started running hot. Then yesterday it wouldn't heat evenly. Today—" Grace gestured helplessly at the smoke still wisping from the vents. Marcus nodded, pulling out diagnostic tools that looked far more sophisticated than anything she'd seen Jim Henderson use. "Your thermostat is shot, but that's just the beginning. This whole unit has been jerry-rigged with incompatible parts." He stood up, fixing her with those perceptive brown eyes. "But there's a bigger problem." Grace's heart sank. "How much bigger?" "Your entire kitchen layout is working against you. The way your equipment is positioned, you're losing about 30% efficiency on energy costs alone. The ventilation system is fighting the heat flow instead of working with it." Marcus gestured around the space with the authority of someone who'd analyzed hundreds of commercial kitchens. "With some strategic repositioning and updated controls, I could cut your monthly utilities by at least $400. Grace stared at him. $400 a month would mean the difference between scraping by and actually having breathing room in her budget. "You can tell all that just from looking around?" "It's what I do," Marcus said simply, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, what I used to do. Now I just fix things." There was something in his tone that made Grace curious, but before she could ask more questions, Marcus was already rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get this oven working for your dinner service. I can do the temporary fix now and come back tomorrow with the right parts for a permanent solution." For the next 2 hours, Grace found herself working alongside Marcus in the cramped space behind the massive oven. Every time they reached for the same tool or maneuvered around each other, she felt an electric awareness that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. His cologne mixed with the scent of machine oil and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. "Hand me that wrench," Marcus asked, his voice slightly breathless from exertion. Grace grabbed the tool from his open case, and their fingers brushed as she passed it to him. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent warmth racing up her arm and made her wonder when she'd last felt this kind of awareness of a man. "You're good at this," she said, watching him work with components she couldn't even name. "Practice," Marcus replied. But there was something guarded in his expression. Lots of practice. By 4 o'clock, the oven was humming quietly and maintaining perfect temperature. Marcus had also adjusted 2 other pieces of equipment and shown Grace how to optimize her prep workflow to save time during busy periods. The changes were subtle, but would make an enormous difference in how smoothly her kitchen operated. "You're not just a repair guy, are you?" Grace asked as they cleaned up. Marcus paused in the middle of packing his tools, and for a moment his professional mask slipped. She glimpsed something complicated in his expression. Pride mixed with regret, competence shadowed by what looked like shame. "I fix things that are broken," he said finally. "That's what I do now." As he closed his toolbox, a business card fluttered to the floor. Grace bent to pick it up before Marcus could stop her, and her eyes widened as she read the elegant script, "Reed and Associates, Premium Restaurant Consulting, Corporate Kitchen Design, Philadelphia, PA." The card was expensive, embossed and completely at odds with the humble handyman persona Marcus had presented. Grace looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I can explain," he said quietly. Grace studied his face, noting the way he held himself, not like a tradesman proud of honest work, but like someone carrying the weight of complicated choices.
"Can you?"
"Because this card suggests you're a lot more than someone who fixes things that are broken." Marcus reached for the card, and Grace let him take it, but not before she'd memorized every detail. "It's complicated." "Most interesting things are," Grace replied, surprised by her own boldness. The late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting everything in golden light. Standing there in the quiet aftermath of crisis, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just about her oven or her business, but about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to trust someone again. "There's a good coffee shop across the street," she said impulsively. "If you're not rushing off to another emergency repair." Marcus hesitated, and Grace held her breath. Then his expression softened into that devastating smile again. "I'd like that." They were locking up the restaurant when Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message made her blood run cold. "Stop asking questions about Marcus Reed, or you'll regret it." Grace looked up to find Marcus watching her with concern. "Everything okay?" She forced a smile, slipping the phone into her pocket. "Fine, just business stuff." But as they walked across Main Street toward the coffee shop, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Marcus Reed was hiding, someone very much wanted it to stay hidden. The next morning brought the kind of crisp October weather that made Millbrook Falls look like a postcard. Grace arrived at the restaurant early, hoping to catch up on prep work before Marcus returned with the permanent parts for her oven. She was surprised to find Mabel Henderson already waiting by the front door, perfectly coiffed hair catching the morning light. "Grace, honey, we need to talk," Mabel announced, following Grace inside without invitation. As the owner of Mabel's Beauty Barn and the town's unofficial information hub, she had appointed herself the keeper of everyone's business. "What about Mabel?" Grace asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew about that man who was here yesterday. The one with the fancy truck and the expensive tools. Mabel settled herself at the counter like she planned to stay a while. "Dolores Peterson saw him asking questions at the hardware store. Specific questions about you, Grace, about how long you've been divorced." Whether you're struggling financially, that sort of thing. Grace's hands stilled on the coffee filters she'd been organizing. What kind of questions? The kind that make a person wonder about his intentions, honey. Think about it. Handsome stranger shows up in a small town, targets a recently divorced woman with a struggling business. Mabel's voice took on the dramatically concerned tone she used when delivering particularly juicy gossip. I'm not saying he's up to something, but I'm not saying it either. Maybe he was just trying to understand the local business climate, Grace suggested, but doubt was already creeping in. The mysterious text from the night before hadn't been far from her thoughts. Or maybe he's the kind of man who preys on vulnerable women, Mabel continued relentlessly. Joan Martinez over in Clearfield told me about a man who showed up there last year, real charming, helped a widow with some repair work. Next thing you know, he's got access to her bank accounts and she's out $12,000. Grace felt her stomach clench. She wanted to defend Marcus, to insist that Mabel was jumping to conclusions, but she couldn't ignore the fact that she knew almost nothing about the man she'd found so attractive. The expensive business card, the sophisticated knowledge, the guarded way he talked about his past, none of it added up to a simple small-town handyman. I appreciate your concern, Grace said carefully, but Marcus helped me solve a serious problem yesterday. My oven is working perfectly now. Oh, I'm sure it is, Mabel replied with a knowing look. But at what cost? And I don't mean the money he charged you, though I'm betting that wasn't cheap either. Before Grace could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in, leaning heavily on her walking stick. At 83, Grace's elderly neighbor was one of the few people in town who could make Mabel Henderson moderate her gossip. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Grace called out gratefully. "Your usual tea and toast?" "Please, dear." Mrs. Chen settled into her favorite booth, but her sharp eyes were focused on Mabel. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. You're talking about the young man who fixed Grace's oven." "We were just expressing some natural concern," Mabel said defensively. "Looking out for Grace's best interests." Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. "In my experience, people who are truly dangerous don't usually announce themselves by asking questions at the hardware store. If this Marcus fellow wanted to deceive Grace, wouldn't he be more subtle about gathering information?" Grace felt a rush of gratitude toward the older woman, but Mabel wasn't ready to give up. "All I'm saying is that Grace should be careful. She's been through enough with that awful divorce. And the last thing she needs is some smooth-talking stranger taking advantage of her vulnerable state." "I'm not vulnerable," Grace said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "I'm rebuilding my life, yes, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about who to trust." Mabel's eyebrows rose at the unexpected pushback. "Of course you are, honey. I just want you to be cautious, that's all." After Mabel finally left, Mrs. Chen accepted her tea and toast with a knowing nod. "That woman means well, but she's never learned the difference between caring and controlling," she observed quietly. "What does your heart tell you about this Marcus?" Grace considered the question seriously. "That he's hiding something, but not something that would hurt me. More like something that hurts him." "Ah," Mrs. Chen sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most trustworthy people are those who've learned the cost of betraying trust." Grace was still pondering that observation when Marcus's truck pulled up outside. Through the window, she watched him unload a box of parts and equipment, moving with that same confident competence she'd found so attractive yesterday. But now, overlaid with Mabel's warnings and the mysterious text message, his self-assurance seemed more complicated. He entered with a smile that made her pulse quicken despite her concerns. "Good morning. Ready to give that oven a permanent fix?" "Absolutely," Grace replied, then found herself adding, "Marcus, can I ask you something?" His expression became guarded. "Sure. Why were you asking questions about me at the hardware store?" Marcus set down his toolbox slowly, and Grace could see him choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to understand the situation I was walking into. Small towns can be complicated for outsiders. I didn't want to inadvertently cause problems for you. It was a reasonable explanation, but something in his tone suggested there were layers she wasn't seeing. "And what did you conclude? That you're respected in this community, but you're also fighting an uphill battle to keep this place running." Marcus met her eyes directly. "And that people care about you enough to be protective, which means I need to be very careful not to give them reasons to worry." Grace felt some of her tension ease. Whatever Marcus was hiding, his concern for her reputation seemed genuine. "The gossip mill is already churning, I'm afraid. I figured it might be. Small towns don't keep secrets well." Marcus's smile was rueful. "Trust me, I know something about that." Before Grace could ask what he meant, he was already unpacking his equipment. "Let's get started. This shouldn't take more than a couple hours. And then you'll have an oven that will last another 20 years. As they worked together, Grace found herself stealing glances at Marcus, trying to reconcile the skilled professional she was observing with the warnings she'd received. His hands moved with practiced confidence, and he explained each step of the repair process in terms she could understand. There was nothing predatory or deceptive in his behavior, just competence, kindness, and an underlying sadness that made her want to comfort him rather than fear him. "There," Marcus announced finally, closing the oven door and wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Try it now." Grace set the temperature and watched as the digital display climbed steadily to exactly the right setting. The heating was even and quiet, better than it had been even when the oven was new. "It's perfect. It should be. I upgraded a few components while I was at it. Consider it part of the service." Marcus began packing his tools, and Grace noticed he moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick exits. "Marcus," she said impulsively, "would you like to stay for lunch? I could make us something, and you could tell me more about that restaurant consulting business on your card." Marcus froze, his hands still on his toolbox. When he looked up, Grace saw something like panic flash across his features before he could mask it. "I should probably get going. I have another appointment this afternoon." "Do you?" Grace challenged gently. "Or are you running away from my questions?" For a long moment they stared at each other across the kitchen. Grace could see him warring with himself, wanting to trust her but held back by whatever he was hiding. Finally, Marcus sighed and straightened up. "My past isn't something I talk about easily," he said quietly. "And I don't want to burden you with problems that aren't your own. What if I want to be burdened?" Grace asked, surprising them both with her honesty. Marcus's expression softened, and he took a step toward her. "Grace, you seem like an incredible woman, and I don't want to—" His words were cut off by the sound of Grace's phone buzzing insistently. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip. Another text from the unknown number. "He's not who he says he is. Ask him about Philadelphia." Grace looked up to find Marcus watching her with growing alarm. "What is it?" She held up the phone, letting him read the message. Marcus went very still, his face draining of color. "Grace, I can explain." "Can you?" Grace's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "Because someone seems very interested in making sure I know you're lying to me." The warmth that had been building between them all morning evaporated, replaced by suspicion and hurt. Marcus looked like he wanted to reach for her, but something in her posture must have warned him off. "It's not what you think," he said desperately. "Yes, I used to work in Philadelphia. And yes, I'm not telling you everything about my past. But I'm not trying to hurt you, Grace. I would never—" "Then tell me the truth," Grace interrupted. "Right now. Who are you really? And why is someone warning me about you?" Marcus stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, he shook his head. "I can't, not yet. There are things you don't understand, things that could put you in danger if you knew too much." "Put me in danger?" Grace's voice rose. "What kind of danger? What have you gotten me involved in?" "Nothing," Marcus said quickly. "You're not involved in anything, I promise. But Grace, please, trust me a little longer, just until I can figure out how to handle this safely." Grace felt tears of frustration building. 24 hours ago, she'd felt more alive than she had in months. Now she was standing in her kitchen, afraid to trust her own instincts about a man who was clearly hiding something significant from her. "I think you should leave," she said quietly. "And I don't think you should come back until you're ready to tell me the truth. All of it." Marcus's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. Instead, he picked up his toolbox and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at her with an expression full of regret. "Grace, for what it's worth, meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time. And I'm sorry I can't give you the honesty you deserve." After he left, Grace stood alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the lingering scent of his cologne and the quiet hum of her perfectly repaired oven. She should have felt relief that she'd protected herself from whatever trouble Marcus Reed represented. Instead, she felt like she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. 3 days had passed since Marcus left Grace's kitchen, and the silence felt heavier than the October fog rolling through Millbrook Falls. Grace threw herself into preparing for the annual Harvest Festival dinner, the restaurant's biggest night of the year. Every table was booked, and she'd promised the town council a menu that would showcase everything Whitmore's kitchen could offer. She was testing her grandmother's famous apple cider glaze when the bell above the door chimed. Grace looked up, hoping despite herself to see Marcus, but instead found her ex-husband Bradley strutting through the dining room like he owned the place. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit screamed success, and the redhead clinging to his arm was at least 10 years younger than Grace. Well, Bradley announced loudly enough for the few early dinner customers to hear. "Look at this place. Still playing restaurant, I see." Grace felt her jaw clench. "Bradley, what do you want? Can't a man check on his ex-wife's little venture?" Bradley's tone dripped condescension as he gestured around the dining room. "Though I have to say, Grace, it looks like you're in over your head. Again." The redhead giggled and whispered something in Bradley's ear that made him smirk. Grace recognized her from somewhere, probably one of his dental hygienists. Bradley had always had a type. "The restaurant is doing fine, thank you," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Is it, though?" Bradley's voice grew sharper. "Because I heard through the grapevine that you've been cozying up to some mysterious stranger." "Really, Grace, a handyman? After everything I gave you, this is how low you've sunk." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. The dining room had gone quiet, customers pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "My personal life is none of your business anymore." "Oh, but your financial life still is," Bradley said with a cruel smile. "Don't forget, darling, that I co-signed some of those equipment loans. And if this place fails, which, let's be honest, it's going to, I'll be on the hook for your poor decisions." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Grace's hands trembled as she set down the mixing bowl she'd been holding. "What are you saying, Bradley?" "I'm saying maybe it's time to cut your losses. Sell this place, pay off the debts, and find something more suitable to your abilities. Maybe a nice job at someone else's restaurant, where you won't have to make actual business decisions." The condescension in his voice was like a physical blow. Grace could feel her customers' embarrassed glances, could sense their pity, and it made her want to disappear through the floor. Grace doesn't need career advice from someone who's too busy chasing his employees to focus on his own practice. The voice came from behind Bradley, and Grace's heart leaped as Marcus stepped into view. He'd entered through the back door so quietly she hadn't heard him, but now he stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his dark eyes fixed on Bradley with obvious dislike. "And you are?" Bradley demanded, puffing up like a threatened rooster. "Someone who appreciates what Grace has built here," Marcus replied evenly. "Someone who recognizes talent when he sees it, instead of trying to tear it down." Bradley's face flushed red. "Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but this is between me and my ex-wife." "No," Marcus said, stepping forward with quiet authority. "This is about you publicly humiliating a woman who's worked incredibly hard to build something meaningful. And that ends now." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Grace could see her customers watching the confrontation with fascination and horror. Who could imagine how this scene would be retold and embellished throughout Millbrook Falls by morning? "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Bradley snarled at Marcus. "Grace is a dreamer, not a businesswoman. She'll drag you down with her when this whole thing collapses." The only thing collapsing here is your dignity, Marcus replied calmly. I think you should leave. Bradley's eyes narrowed dangerously. You know what? Fine. But Grace, don't come crying to me when your little boyfriend here disappears and you're left with nothing but debt and broken dreams. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. And don't think I won't call in those loans if you keep making a fool of yourself. After Bradley and his girlfriend stormed out, the dining room remained unnaturally quiet. Grace stood frozen behind the counter, mortified by the public scene and shaken by Bradley's threats. She could feel her customers' curious stares, could practically hear the gossip already forming. Marcus approached her slowly, his expression gentle with concern.
Grace, are you okay?
No, she whispered, then louder. No, I'm not okay. I'm humiliated and angry and scared that he might actually follow through on his threats. He won't, Marcus said with quiet certainty. Men like that are all bluster when they're trying to maintain control. But Grace, there's something you should know. Before he could finish, Grace became aware of movement around them. Her customers were standing up, and for a moment she thought they were leaving in disgust. Instead, old Mr. Patterson approached the counter with his wallet out. Grace, honey, my wife and I would like to pay for everyone's dinner tonight, he announced. Consider it our way of showing that some people in this town know quality when they see it. That's not necessary, Grace began. But Mrs. Rodriguez was already joining Mr. Patterson at the counter. Actually, it is, she said firmly. My family's been coming here since your grandmother ran this place. And we're not about to let some pompous fool tell us what good food tastes like. One by one, Grace's customers came forward, not just to pay their own bills, but to leave generous tips and words of encouragement. By the time the dining room cleared, Grace was fighting back tears of gratitude. See, Marcus said softly. You have more support than you realize. Grace turned to face him, suddenly aware that he'd witnessed her public humiliation and stepped in to defend her. Thank you. For standing up to Bradley, I mean. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Marcus replied simply. No one should have to face that kind of cruelty alone. They stood in the quiet dining room, and Grace felt the attraction that had been building between them flare back to life despite all her reservations. Marcus had seen her at her most vulnerable and hadn't turned away. Instead, he'd protected her, defended her worth when she couldn't find the words to defend herself. Marcus, she began, about the other day when I asked you to leave. You were protecting yourself, Marcus interrupted. You were right to be cautious. I haven't been completely honest with you, and you deserve better than that. Then be honest now, Grace said, stepping closer. Tell me who you really are. Marcus looked like he wanted to, like the words were fighting to escape. But before he could respond, Grace's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's the bank. At this hour? Ms. Whitmore? The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. This is Janet Mills from First National. I'm calling to inform you that there's been some concern raised about your loan status, and we'll need to schedule a meeting to review your account. Grace's blood ran cold. What kind of concern? I'd rather discuss the details in person. Can you come in tomorrow morning at 9? After Grace hung up, she stared at Marcus with growing dread. Bradley wasn't bluffing. He's actually trying to force me into default. Marcus's jaw tightened with anger. He can't just call in your loans because he's angry. He can, if he claims I'm a credit risk, Grace said shakily. And after that scene tonight, after the gossip about my mysterious boyfriend, he might have grounds to argue that I'm making poor decisions. The weight of the situation settled over them both. Grace felt the walls of her carefully rebuilt life closing in around her. Everything she'd worked for, everything her grandmother had built, could disappear because she'd dared to stand up to a man who couldn't bear to see her succeed without him. There has to be something we can do, Marcus said desperately. Grace looked at him. This man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying, who'd defended her when she couldn't defend herself, who was hiding secrets that someone thought she should know about. In that moment, she made a choice that surprised them both. There is, she said quietly, You can tell me the truth, all of it, because whatever you're hiding, it can't be worse than losing everything I've worked for." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sank into one of the dining room chairs and buried his face in his hands. "My name is Marcus Reed, and I used to be one of Philadelphia's most successful restaurant consultants," he began quietly. "My company, Reed and Associates, specialized in helping major chains optimize their operations and expand into new markets." Grace took the seat across from him, her heart pounding. "What happened?" "I was good at my job. Too good, maybe. I could walk into any restaurant and see exactly how to make it more profitable, more efficient, more appealing to corporate buyers." Marcus's voice was thick with regret. "I thought I was helping people build better businesses. I didn't realize until too late what I was really doing, which was—" Marcus looked up and Grace saw pain etched deep in his features. "I was helping major chains systematically destroy family-owned restaurants. My efficiency reports, my optimization suggestions, they weren't being used to help small business owners. They were being used to identify targets for acquisition and displacement." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. Targets? The chain would hire me to consult for a small restaurant, supposedly to help them improve their operations. I'd spend weeks analyzing their business, their customers, their community connections. Then I'd write a detailed report outlining their strengths and weaknesses. Marcus's voice grew bitter. What I didn't know was that my partner was selling those reports to corporate buyers who used the information to open competing locations, undercut prices, and drive the family businesses into bankruptcy. "My God," Grace whispered. "By the time I realized what was happening, we'd destroyed dozens of places just like this one," Marcus continued. "Restaurants that had been feeding their communities for generations, providing jobs, creating gathering places where people felt at home. All gone, replaced by sterile chain locations with no soul and no connection to the people they served." Grace could see the weight of guilt he'd been carrying, could understand now why he'd seemed so careful, so guarded. "What did you do when you found out?" "I tried to stop it, tried to expose what my partner was doing, tried to warn the restaurants we'd targeted, but I was in too deep. My name was on all the reports. My reputation was tied to the company's success." Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the table. "My partner had made sure I was legally culpable for everything. When I threatened to go public, he had me framed for embezzlement." "The money those threatening texts mentioned?" Marcus nodded grimly. "I took money from the company accounts, but not to steal it. I used it to try to compensate some of the families we'd hurt, to help them relocate or start over. But legally, it looked like theft." Grace felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So you ran." "I liquidated everything I owned, paid back every penny I could and disappeared. I've been moving from town to town ever since, taking odd jobs, trying to stay under the radar while using my skills to help small businesses instead of destroying them." Marcus looked at her with desperate honesty. "That's why I can't stay in one place too long. That's why someone's sending you warnings. My former partner has people looking for me, and if they find me—" "What happens if they find you?" "I go to prison for embezzlement and fraud. And anyone who's helped me or harbored me could be charged as an accessory." Marcus reached across the table as if to take her hand, then stopped himself. "That's why I couldn't tell you the truth, Grace. Not because I don't trust you, but because knowing the truth puts you in danger." Grace stared at him, processing everything he'd told her. The expensive tools, the sophisticated knowledge, the careful way he talked about his past. It all made sense now. But instead of feeling betrayed or frightened, she felt something else entirely. "You've been trying to protect me," she said softly. "I've been trying not to drag you down with me." Marcus corrected. "You have enough problems without adding my baggage to them." Grace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where she'd grown up, where she'd built her dreams, where she was now fighting to keep them alive. Behind her, she could feel Marcus waiting for her judgment, probably expecting her to ask him to leave and never come back. Instead, she turned around and met his eyes directly. "I have a proposition for you." Marcus looked surprised. "Grace, tomorrow I have to face the bank and probably lose everything I've worked for," Grace interrupted. "My ex-husband is trying to destroy me out of spite, and half the town thinks I'm making poor decisions by trusting a stranger. I'm probably going to lose this restaurant, my home, and my reputation all in one day." "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I never wanted my problems to hurt you." "They haven't hurt me," Grace said firmly, "but they might be able to save me." Marcus frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to suggest. "You said you used to be one of Philadelphia's most successful restaurant consultants, that you could walk into any restaurant and see exactly how to make it more profitable and efficient." "Yes, but—" "Then help me save Whitmore's kitchen. Use those skills to show the bank that this restaurant isn't a failing business. It's an underutilized asset with enormous potential." Grace's voice grew stronger as the plan formed in her mind. "Help me put together a business plan that proves I'm not a credit risk. I'm an investment opportunity." Marcus stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Grace, if I help you and my former partner finds out, you'll be implicated in everything. You could lose more than just your restaurant." "I could," Grace agreed. "But I'm going to lose it anyway if I don't take this risk. At least this way, I'm fighting for something instead of just waiting for it to be taken away." They looked at each other across the empty dining room, both balanced on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Grace could see Marcus, warring with himself, wanting to help her, but terrified of the consequences for both of them. Finally, Marcus stood up and extended his hand to her. "If we're going to do this, we need to work fast. And Grace, if this goes wrong, if my past catches up with us, you need to promise me you'll let me take the blame for everything." Grace took his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. "And you need to promise me something too." "What's that?" "That you'll stop trying to protect me from my own choices," Grace said firmly. "I'm not a victim, Marcus. I'm a woman who's decided to fight for what matters to her. And what matters to me right now is saving this restaurant and keeping you in my life." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Even knowing what you know about my past?" "Especially knowing what I know about your past," Grace replied. "You made mistakes, but you tried to fix them. You hurt people, but you've spent years trying to make amends. That doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you human, and it makes you someone worth taking a risk for." As they stood there in the quiet restaurant, hands linked and eyes locked, Grace felt something shift between them. The careful distance Marcus had maintained was gone, replaced by a connection that went deeper than attraction or convenience. They were partners now, allies in a fight that could cost them everything. "So," Grace said with a smile that felt like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, "ready to help me save my grandmother's restaurant?" Marcus smiled back, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked truly hopeful. "Let's get to work." But as they began clearing the dining room tables to make space for planning, neither of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the man inside it who was making notes about everything he'd observed through the restaurant's large front windows. Grace and Marcus worked through the night, transforming her dining room into a war room filled with financial documents, menu analyses, and operational projections. By dawn, they had created a comprehensive business plan that showcased Whitmore's kitchen not as a struggling small-town diner, but as an underutilized community asset with significant growth potential. The numbers don't lie, Marcus said, pointing to the revenue projections spread across the table. With strategic menu optimization and expanded catering services, you could increase profits by 60% within 12 months. Grace studied the detailed charts he'd created, amazed by the professional quality of his analysis. You really were good at your job. I was, Marcus admitted quietly. I just wish I'd used these skills for the right purposes from the beginning. They were reviewing the final presentation when Grace's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, and Grace felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Don't answer it, Marcus warned, but Grace was already swiping to accept the call. Grace Whitmore, she said cautiously. Ms. Whitmore, this is Detective Raymond Torres with the Philadelphia Police Department. I'm calling about Marcus Reed. We have reason to believe he may have contacted you recently. Grace's eyes met Marcus's across the table, and she saw him go pale. I'm not sure what you're talking about, she said carefully. Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Reed is wanted in connection with a major embezzlement case. If he's contacted you or attempted to involve you in any business dealings, you need to know that you could be charged as an accessory after the fact. Grace's hand tightened on the phone. What exactly are you accusing him of? Theft of over $2 million from Reed and Associates, money laundering and fraud. His former business partner, David Hamilton, has been cooperating with our investigation. If you're harboring Mr. Reed or helping him in any way, I strongly advise you to reconsider. The call ended, and Grace stared at her phone in shock. $2 million. Money laundering. The charges were far more serious than Marcus had led her to believe. Grace, Marcus began desperately, I can explain. Can you? Grace's voice was sharp with hurt and anger. Because that detective just told me you're wanted for stealing $2 million, and somehow you forgot to mention that part last night. Marcus looked stricken. The amount is inflated. Hamilton is making it sound worse than stealing $2 million? Grace interrupted. Marcus, how much worse can it get? Before Marcus could answer, the front door of the restaurant burst open. Two men in expensive suits strode in, followed by the unmistakable bulk of law enforcement. Grace recognized the lead man from the description Detective Torres had given over the phone. Marcus Reed, the first man announced, pulling out a badge. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. Marcus stood slowly, his hands raised in surrender. Grace had nothing to do with any of this, he said clearly. She's innocent. That remains to be determined, Detective Torres replied, nodding to his partner. Miss Whitmore, we're going to need to search these premises and question you about your relationship with Mr. Reed. Grace watched in horror as they handcuffed Marcus, her mind reeling from the speed at which her world was collapsing. The business plan they'd worked on all night lay scattered across the table, evidence of their partnership that could now be used against her. I have the right to remain silent, Marcus said, looking directly at Grace. And so do you. Don't say anything without a lawyer present. As they led Marcus away, Grace stood frozen in her dining room, surrounded by the remnants of their all-night planning session. Through the window, she could see a crowd gathering on Main Street, drawn by the police cars and the drama unfolding at Whitmore's kitchen. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Told you he wasn't who he claimed to be. Some people never learn. 2 hours later, Grace sat in the police station's interrogation room, facing Detective Torres across a scarred metal table. She'd called the only lawyer she knew, Tom Sullivan, no relation to her late husband, who handled real estate transactions and the occasional traffic ticket. Miss Whitmore, Detective Torres began, how long have you known Marcus Reed? About a week, Grace replied, following Tom's advice to answer only direct questions with minimal information. And in that week, what was the nature of your relationship? Grace hesitated. He repaired my oven. We had coffee a few times. Did he ask you for money? Did he try to involve you in any business ventures or investment opportunities? Grace thought about the business plan they'd created together, The way Marcus had offered to help her save the restaurant. No, Ms. Whitmore, we found extensive financial documents in your restaurant this morning, along with what appears to be a detailed business analysis. Are you telling me Marcus Reed had nothing to do with creating those documents? Grace's lawyer leaned forward. Detective, unless you're charging my client with a crime, I think we're done here. We're not charging anyone yet, Torres replied. But Ms. Whitmore, I want you to understand something. Marcus Reed is a dangerous man who has made a career out of manipulating vulnerable people. If you're protecting him because you think he cares about you, you're making a serious mistake. After they released her, Grace drove home through streets that felt hostile and unfamiliar. News of Marcus's arrest had spread through Millbrook Falls like wildfire, and she could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations wherever she went. She found Mabel Henderson waiting on her front porch, flanked by Mrs. Rodriguez and 2 other women from the church auxiliary. "Grace, honey, we came as soon as we heard," Mabel announced, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're so worried about you. To think that man was using you this whole time." "He wasn't using me," Grace said wearily, fumbling with her keys. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Rodriguez said sadly, "that's exactly what they want you to think. These con men are very good at making their victims feel special, feel chosen." "I'm not a victim," Grace protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Of course you are, dear," Mabel continued relentlessly. "A recent divorcee, struggling financially, emotionally vulnerable. You were the perfect target. Thank goodness the police caught him before he could do any real damage." Grace finally got her door open and turned to face the women. "Thank you for your concern, but I'm fine." "Are you, though?" one of the other women asked. "Because I heard Bradley is planning to call in your loans after this scandal. He's saying you've proven you're not capable of making sound business decisions." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on Marcus's arrest that she'd forgotten about her meeting with the bank, about Bradley's threats, about the very real possibility that she was about to lose everything. "The whole town is talking about it," Mabel added, with barely concealed satisfaction. "About how you let a criminal into your restaurant, into your life. People are saying maybe Bradley was right about you all along." After the women left, Grace sat alone in her living room, staring at the business plan she'd brought home from the restaurant. Marcus's careful analysis, his professional recommendations, his promise to help her save her grandmother's legacy, all of it tainted now by the revelation of who he really was. Her phone rang, and Grace saw it was her lawyer. "Grace, I have some information about your friend, Marcus Reed." "What kind of information?" "I did some digging into his case. The charges against him are serious, but there are some inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. It's possible he's not as guilty as they're making him out to be." Grace felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone might be setting him up to take the fall for crimes he didn't commit. But Grace, if that's true, then you could be in more danger than we thought. If Reed was getting close to exposing the real criminals, they might see you as a threat too." After the call ended, Grace found herself thinking about everything Marcus had told her, about the way he'd tried to protect her, about the genuine remorse she'd seen in his eyes when he talked about the restaurants his work had destroyed. Despite everything the police had said, despite the evidence against him, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Reed was exactly who he'd claimed to be, a man trying to atone for past mistakes. The next morning brought devastating news. Grace arrived at the bank to find that Bradley had indeed moved to accelerate her loan payments, citing moral turpitude and association with criminal elements as grounds for calling in the debt immediately. The bank president, a golf buddy of Bradley's, was sympathetic but firm. "Grace, you know I've always liked you, but the board is concerned about the negative publicity. We can't be seen supporting businesses that are associated with criminal activity." "Marcus repaired my oven," Grace protested. "That hardly constitutes criminal association." "Come now, Grace, the whole town knows you were romantically involved with the man. The police found business documents at your restaurant that suggest a much deeper relationship. The bank president's expression was genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, but unless you can come up with $150,000 by the end of the week, we'll have to begin foreclosure proceedings." Grace left the bank feeling numb. $150,000 might as well have been $100 million. Her restaurant was doomed. Her reputation was in ruins, and the man she'd begun to care about was sitting in jail, possibly facing decades in prison. She was walking across the town square when she noticed Mrs. Chen sitting on a bench, feeding pigeons from a paper bag. The elderly woman looked up as Grace approached. "Sit with me, dear," Mrs. Chen said gently. "You look like you could use some perspective." Grace sank onto the bench beside her neighbor, grateful for any kindness in a world that suddenly felt hostile and cold. "I suppose you've heard about Marcus," Grace said quietly. "I've heard what people are saying," Mrs. Chen replied carefully. "But I've lived long enough to know that what people say and what's true are often very different things. The police say he stole $2 million. And what does your heart say?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the pigeons peck at the breadcrumbs around their feet. "My heart says he's a good man, who made bad choices and has been trying to make them right ever since." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Hearts are often wiser than heads when it comes to judging character." "But what if I'm wrong? What if everyone else is right, and I'm just a fool who got taken in by a charming criminal? Then you'll have been fooled by someone who repaired your oven perfectly, defended you against your ex-husband's cruelty, and stayed up all night helping you create a plan to save your business," Mrs. Chen observed dryly. "As conmen go, he seems remarkably focused on actually helping you rather than harming you." Grace looked at the older woman with surprise. "You know about the business plan?" "Dear, in a town this size, everyone knows everything eventually. The question is, are you going to let fear and other people's opinions keep you from fighting for what you believe in?" That evening, Grace sat in her empty restaurant, staring at the business plan Marcus had helped her create. The analysis was brilliant, the projections were sound, and the recommendations could genuinely transform her struggling business into a thriving community asset. She thought about Marcus sitting in jail, probably expecting her to hate him, probably convinced he'd destroyed any chance they might have had together. She thought about Bradley's smug satisfaction, about Mabel's false sympathy, about the bank's ultimatum. Then she thought about her grandmother, who had built this restaurant from nothing during the Great Depression, who had fed her community through good times and bad, who had never let other people's opinions stop her from doing what she knew was right. Grace picked up her phone and dialed her lawyer's number. "Tom, it's Grace. I need to ask you something about Marcus Reed's case. If someone had evidence that could help prove his innocence, what would they need to do?" "They'd need to present it to the district attorney's office in Philadelphia," Tom replied. "But Grace, getting involved in a criminal case at this level could be very dangerous. What if the evidence was in the business documents Marcus helped me create? What if his analysis of my restaurant's operations contained proof that he was trying to help small businesses rather than destroy them?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "That could be significant. But Grace, are you sure you want to risk everything on the word of a man you've known for a week?" Grace looked around her grandmother's restaurant, at the pictures on the walls showing decades of community gatherings, celebrations, and everyday moments of human connection. She thought about Marcus's gentle hands repairing her oven, his protective stance when Bradley had tried to humiliate her, his desperate attempts to shield her from the consequences of his past.
"Yes," she said firmly.
"I'm sure." The next morning, Grace drove to Philadelphia with a folder full of documents and a heart full of determination. She was about to risk everything on faith, on intuition, and on the belief that sometimes the most important truths can't be proven with evidence. They can only be felt with the heart. As her car pulled into the city, Grace whispered a prayer to her grandmother's memory and prepared to fight for the man who had taught her that some fires were worth tending, no matter how dangerous the flames. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.